Who can be a historian? Pag-uusapan natin yan dito sa 4th episode ng podcast, Conversations on Philippine History, Politics, and Society. Welcome everyone! 4th episode na tayo dito sa ating 6-part series na essentially ay History 101. This time, we will be answering the question, who can be a historian? Ako nga pala si D.
Ako si Aaron.
At ako naman si Beck. Last episode, ang sinagot nating tanong ay how do we make history? So dito nabanggit natin yung iba't ibang uri ng sources, methods, at source criticism at interpretation. So ngayon naman, mas ibabaling natin yung usapan sa element ng tao behind historical scholarship. Sino nga ba ang pwedeng maging historiador?
Tama, no? Actually, to me, parang hanggang ngayon, ang bigat pa rin nung tanong na yan. Parang kasing ang laki nung based sa mga past discussions, kwentuhan na rin natin, no? Parang ang bigat ng connotation kapag historian or historiador ka kasi nga yung immense importance nung discipline na hina-highlight natin. I don't think I'm just speaking for myself when I say na kahit tayong mga may degree sa history, parang minsan hindi rin comfortable na matawag na historian or, di ba? Or education lang din ba natin yun? Di ba? Ikaw, Lee?
Actually, hindi ko rin alam kung bakit eh. Naalala ko lang when I entered college as a BA History student, yung una kong ginawang email account ay historiador@yahoo.com. Kasi
Wow.
diba, freshman ako noon eh. Yun nga, hindi ko kasi alam. Wala pa akong idea na may mabigat na connotation nga yung kapag tinatawag kang historiador or historian. Basta ang alam ko lang, kapag natapos ako ng 4-year course ng BA History, historian ako. Diba? I was a freshman, okay? Nung na-realize ko na ang bigat ng title na yon, hindi ko na masyado ginamit yung email kasi parang yun nga medyo cringy. Ikaw ba, Beck? Ano ang pakiramdam when people refer to you as a historian?
Alam mo, same. Medyo nakaka-cringe din siya. And usually, when I refer to myself, parang I call myself a student of history. Parang ganon. Especially when I was still studying ng master's or I teach history. Parang ganon. Pero yun nga, it took a while. Hanggang ngayon naman, uncomfortable pa rin ako dun sa label na historian. Kasi feeling ko, yung connotation nun, yung naka-attach doon sa title na yon would be meron ka nang na-produce na magnum opus na matatawag, 'di ba, bilang achievement mo in order to claim yourself as a legitimate historian. You already have a solid contribution to the discipline, mga ganon. Pero naisip ko din, parang bakit hindi? Why are we so uncomfortable on claiming the title? Lalo na kung we are conducting historical research naman talaga. So, tingin nyo ba?
Actually, no, nandun na rin ako sa point na dapat nga, actually, nung inedit ko nga yung LinkedIn account ko, nilagay ko dun na I am a historian by training. Na talagang gusto ko rin actually i-claim, na simulan ng i-claim na maging comfortable dun sa title, kung title mang siyang matatawag na historian. Kasi 'di ba parang minsan kung meron kang apprehension dun sa paggamit ng term na yun, parang manifestation siya ng imposter syndrome, 'di ba? If it makes sense, when you doubt your skills, talents, and accomplishments. Kasi halimbawa, yung mga engineer, architect, hindi rin naman nila, or lawyers, doctors, hindi naman nila alam yung 100% nung field nila, 'di ba? Pero ginagamit nila yung term na yun. So bakit tayo parang nangingimi tayo na tawagin yung sarili natin na historian kahit na meron tayong kiniklaim na field of research area, 'di ba? Na hindi naman hindi natin alam lahat about history. Pero bakit parang ang hirap sa atin ibuga yung term na I'm a historian, yung mga ganyan, 'di ba? So feeling ko dapat nga din na nasimulan na rin nating i-normalize, kung tama man yung term ko, na normalize yung pag-claim. Kasi parang ano rin yun ownership and taking pride siguro dun sa field, 'di ba? No? Kaya din sakto tong episode natin ngayon para siguro mahimay natin yung sino ba yung pwedeng maging historiador, saka saka natin sagutin yung tanong siguro kung historian tayo after ng discussion natin, 'di ba? Na parang ang bigat din no na existensya. Totoo ba ako? Ganyan. Pero gusto ko rin na reflection point siguro sa discussion kwentuhan natin ngayon. Yung broader ideas ng kung wala kang history degree at talagang ang kapal ng mukha mo kung i-claim mo yung pagiging historian kung hindi ka naman nagpa-practice dun sa field na yun. Paano ba yung thinking like a historian, 'di ba? Yung basics na yun. Tapos syempre later on, kung i-claim mo yung term na historian, ano yung responsibilities na dapat alam mo kung ikaw ay magna-navigate dun sa mundo ng historians talking about the past, 'di ba?
Actually, magandang idea yan. Mako-cover natin lahat sa episode na to. Yung iba't ibang ideas concerning, at least, what it entails to be a historian. So, ako naman, sa tanong na who can be a historian, ang sagot ko talaga dyan ay anyone could be a historian. Diba? Itong profesyong to, hindi naman tutulad ng ibang profesyon. Sabi nga ni Aaron, engineer, architect, lawyer, doctor. Hindi naman natin kailangan ng board exam, certification. Wala namang professional regulation sa Pilipinas. Ang kailangan lang natin ay mag-aral at magsuri ng nakaraan para makapagsulat ng kasaysayan. Pero naisip ko rin, hindi ba, sa tingin nyo ba, dapat ba i-professionalize natin ang history as a field?
Parang ang weird.
Kasi ano ba muna yung definition mo ng professionalize?
Alam mo yun, parang may board exam.
Kasi usually, yung mga qualifying exams na yan, ginagawa yan for courses na ang tatawag ko na lang sa kanya ay vocational. Ibig sabihin, you're training for a specific skill. Ang history kasi, bilang isang degree, for example, it's a liberal arts degree. So, it's more like really teaching you how to think. Kapag, di ba, kapag nag-take ka ng isang liberal arts na degree, mga BA, AB, ganon. Yung mga vocational courses like engineering,
technical
nursing,
courses.
Yeah. Oo. So yun yung kailangan ng qualifying exam, pero yun nga parang we're more concerned on, teaching people how to think, how to look at the world.
Yeah.
So yun yung skill ng liberal arts eh.
Actually, agree ako dun kay Vec. Tsaka pag kasi naglagay ka ng ganun yung sa literature tinatawag yun na institutional gatekeeping. Yung gine-gatekeep mo kung sino yung authority figures or yung may authority in that particular field, 'di ba? Na kung magkakaroon kasi ang daming tanong na magwi-bring up kung tatanungin tayo kung dapat bang i-professionalize yung history kasi unang tanong, sinong gagawa ng exam? Tapos ano yung laman ng exam, 'di ba? Ano yung barometers mo para masabi na ikaw ay quote-unquote historian at hindi, 'di ba? No? So, tsaka baka din maging avenue for hindi ko alam, elitism na alam mo yun,
makikreate. Baka censorship eh.
'Di ba? Censorship
for example,
din.
Syempre state yung magre-regulate niyan. So,
exactly.
If you do not subscribe to a particular historical tradition na
tapos kapag may
radical,
license ka kasi, it can be both good and bad. Kung may license ka nga naman, kung meron kang malpractice na matatawag, pwede kang ma-revoke ng license. So, mawawala yung credibility mo, di ba? Pero in the same vein, pwede ma-politicize, di ba? Idangle yung license na yun to censor you, di ba? Na parang hindi ka pwedeng magsalita ng ito kasi meron tayong quote-unquote standards na ina-uphold na ano. So, yeah. I think fruitful yung discussion about professionalizing history. Siguro we can devote even an episode on that in the future. Pero, 'di ba? Parang ang hirap niya. Kasi tama yung agree ako dun sa pinanggagalingan ni Vec na liberal arts yun eh. Para mong mini-measure yung thinking. 'Di ba?
At yun nga, at ang reality is, in the Philippines, and I think in the world today, there's really no regulation of history as a profession. So, ang downside
State
naman
regulation.
nun, at least state regulation. Ang downside naman nun is anybody can claim that they are a historian. To the point na minsan nakukonfuse din natin yung isang history enthusiast, yung isang mahilig, may interest sa kasaysayan, o yung isang hobbyist or yung isang antique collector, they can just easily claim, I'm a historian, na talagang kahit hindi naman sila involved sa research or sa pagsusulat ng kasaysayan. Not that it's a bad thing, kasi alam naman nating separate yung pagtingin sa history as a hobby and history as a profession. Pero for me, what sets a historian apart is that a historian is someone who is immersed in primary sources. Itong connection sa primary sources o yung tinatawag natin sa Filipino na primaryang batis, mahalaga talaga ito para sa mga historians. Yung attention to sources na ginagamit ng isang historian para mag-argue whatever case a historian is arguing for. Yun talaga yung para sa akin buod ng pagiging isang historiador. Kasi sa history, when we make claims, we base it on evidence. And historians must be proficient and capable to use the proper sources to boost their claim. At maraming kailangang auxiliary skills sa history. Kasi history in itself is not really a skill. Aminin natin yan. We talk about historical thinking as a skill. We talk about chronological thinking as a skill. Pero yung history itself as a skill, it needs auxiliary skills para talagang maging well-rounded ka. Halimbawa, if you want to be a historian, let's say, of 18th century Philippines, kailangan matibay yung knowledge mo ng Spanish as a language. At hindi lang Spanish as a language, pati yung paleography, kasi the way people write also change. So, hindi ganun kadali. Diba? It really is a very technical thing to be a historian of anything. Like, for example, I remember when I was trying to choose my master's topic, master's research topic, thesis topic, gusto ko gawin Japanese period. And I was working on this topic only to find out na may nakagawa na ng katulad na research and that person speaks Japanese and access Japanese sources. So, alam ko na agad na if I do the same research, I won't be adding anything new to the discussion. So, kayo ba, meron pa pang ibang skill sa tingin ninyo na necessary skills para sa isang historiador?
Well, agree naman ako dun sa sinabi mo, Lee, na yung facility ng language, no? Pero, I think kailangan din yung sinabi mo kanina, ang striking sa akin nung sinabi mo na wala kang mako-contribute na bago. I think, lagi naman tayong may mako-contribute na bago. 'Di ba? Na kung kahit na hindi natin ma-access yung primary sources or wala tayong facility ng language. Kasi yun nga yung sinasabi ni Beck na it's a liberal arts degree. Yung idea ng liberal dun, 'di ba? Na yung thinking, yung free thinking. So, we can always, 'di ba? Add something. So, kung ganun, I think mahalaga rin sa history, maintindihan natin na, yun nga, gusto ko yung point mo na may mga auxiliary skills. I think yung basic, yung writing skill, 'di ba? Yung kakayahan na magsulat. Kasi paano mo nga yung discussion natin sa mga previous kwentuhan natin na paano mo transform yung history as the past into history as the narrative kung hindi mo kayang magsulat ng narrative. So I think isa yun sa basic skill na kailangan ma-master ng isang nagtatangkang maging historian. Ikaw, Vec?
Well, yung ibang, kasi ngayon, yung disiplina ng history, nagda-diversify siya eh. To the point na may mga gumagawa, halimbawa ng ethno-history, diba? So, iba pa rin yung skill.
History.
Oo. So, for example, dun sa ethno-history, I think ibang skill pa rin na I think yung mga mas conventional na historiador, hindi masyadong magaling dito. Yung pag-conduct ng oral history research. Yung interviews, ganyan. So, ibang skill pa rin yun altogether. Tapos yung binabanggit na Aaron na may mga historiador na involved naman sa quantitative data. So, kailangan nilang matutunan ang cliometrics. Yun yung tawag nila dyan, parang historical na statistics, basically. So, iba pa rin yun. So, at itong mga bagong development sa history na, di ba, babanggitin siguro natin to in the next episodes. Meron tayong issue naman ng kung dati lagi nating problema ang scarcity ng sources. Ngayon naman abundance. So later, I think historians should be able to have skills on algorithms. So I
Organizing.
think, organizing of data.
Pero true, yun nga rin yung isa sa mga problema ng historians, no? Ang dami kasing sources. Minsan, actually, madaling malunod sa dami ng sources natin. Minsan naman, kakarampot yung sources. So, parang, ang challenge dito for historians is that we should always remember that a good historian will not make claims without enough evidence. In the same way that a good historian will not write history out of thin air. Na-cover natin itong aspetong ito sa ng paggamit ng history for a certain agenda sa ibang episode, sa earlier episode. But I think it bears repeating that although the historian's bias manifests through their choice of sources, a historian is and must always be fair. A historian must not dismiss counter-evidence without sufficient reasons. Trip-trip lang. Or it doesn't fit my analysis so hindi ko na isasama. I think that's wrong. Kailangan mo i-prove kung bakit hindi mo siya isasama at kailangan mo siyang banggitin. And again, kung mayroon mang ma-encounter na contrary evidence, ang dapat gawin ng isang maayos at ng isang good historian ay gamitin pa rin ito, i-recognize ito, at i-rationalize kung bakit niya hindi gagamitin itong counter evidence na ito.
I think I agree, Lee, dun sa point mo, no, yung dun sa being fair. 'Di ba? Kaya nga minsan yung question sa isang historian, should a historian always be objective? 'Di ba? Pero kasi yung idea, wala namang taong objective, 'di ba? Isang social science debate rin yun, objectivity. Lagi tayong may bias kasi yung bias natin galing yun sa own personal history natin, kung saan ka nag-aral, saan ka lumaki, sinong kaibigan mo, sinong teacher mo. Parang to ask a historian to be objective is like asking a historian to strip himself of his identity. 'Di ba? So parang yung fairness, parang yun yung mas mahalaga, yung impartiality na titignan mo yung contrary evidence. Tapos yung kakayahan mo to navigate these competing arguments and argue for your own, 'di ba? Yun yung
kaya
mahalaga.
Nga parang instead na aiming for objectivity, sabi nila we should instead aim for reliability.
Yeah.
So yun
and practice impartiality in the process, 'di ba?
So I think isa din yung marker ng isang professional historian na lubog sa sources. Yung gagamitin mo lang ay parang despite certain biases that you have, alam mo na yung ginagamit mong sources ay reliable sources at hindi, yun nga, tulad ng pinag-uusapan natin last episode, hindi siya mga fake forgeries.
At wala kang deliberately nililive out dahil contrary yung sinasabi sa gusto mong argument. 'Di ba?
Yes.
Yun yung sinasabi nila kanina.
Isa pang bagay na dapat alalahanin, no, for a person to be a good historian is that we must always remember our values and appreciation are rooted in the present. Yet the sources that we use are from the past. Kaya dapat maingat tayo sa paggamit ng sources kasi the biases and values we hold today may not be applicable to the past, or if I dare say, it is not applicable in the past. But ibang lens yung gamitin natin when we analyze the past using sources. That intentional or unintentional neglect of chronological relation is what we call anachronism. When we disregard the realities of the people in the past and refer to them using today's sensibilities, that's anachronism. And as historians, we don't want to do that. Kayo ba? What do you think about anachronism? Kasi lagi nababanggit to no? Pero do you have any examples?
Yung kinukwento natin na example in the previous episode, no? Yung kwento daw, di umano ni Rizal na may
na friend
girl siya
zone.
na friend zone sa UST habang sila ay nasa Azotea. At si Rizal, that time, sabi ng kwento, ay nagbabasa ng Mark Twain. So, at syempre alam naman natin that Mark Twain came in much, much later. Okay,
Yes.
so siguro si Rizal was in UST around 1870s. So wala pa nun si Mark Twain. At
Hindi naman
lalong-lalo
1870s, mga 1880s naman. Well, tama, 1870s.
1870s. Rizal was in UST in 1870s. And Mark Twain wasn't published yet during the time. So that's one example of anachronism.
Or I could also mention, how can Rizal be reading English when during that time he has not yet learned the language? Diba? He was not
Established
yet...
fact ba yun? Na hindi pa siya marunong
Yeah.
mag-English noon?
Oo, kaya sa England na siya natutong mag-English.
Okay.
Nasa Europa na
90s
siya.
na yun eh. Oo.
Yan, tama. No, so I think no, para lang to illustrate further yung anachronism. Pag halimbawa sa popular media, for example, diba, kung may pinapanood kang pelikula na nakalagay sa setting, kunwari niya supposedly ay 2010 siya, ganyan. Pero may napanood kang eksena na may isang character na naglalakad na may iPad Pro, diba? Diba? Parang pag pinanood mo yon, ma-appreciate mo ba yung pelikula na nagki-claim na 2010 pero meron siyang gamit na wala pa nung panahon na yon, diba? So yung ganun din, I think, yung sa historians na kailangan mo talagang maging sensitive sa context nung panahon na gusto mong pag-aralan at isulat, kasi hindi pwedeng mawaglit sa isip mo na ibang panahon yun sa panahon mo or sa iba pang panahon.
Totoo yan. Kasi it really destroys, not really, well, it makes it difficult for people to understand, no? Kapag nakikita nila yung iba't ibang bagay mula sa iba't ibang panahon, nagsasama-sama sa isang lugar, nasisira yung the way the past is depicted. Parang mo na rin sinabi na, sa dokumentong to, kumakain si Rizal ng cheeseburger. Wala pang cheeseburger nun. It really destroys how people see the past. Pero just to go back to my earlier point, no, sabi ko kanina, a historian is immersed in primary sources. Pero hindi lang ganun kadali yun. There are many hobbyists, antique collectors, and enthusiasts who may also be immersed to a certain extent on primary sources. But being a historian is not just about collecting memorabilia in books. Ako personally, hindi ako mahilig sa ganyan. Kasi mas gusto ko yung digital scans, digitized copies, mas madaling dalhin kahit saan.
Saka nakakatakot gumamit ng lumang dokumento, ha?
Actually, totoo.
Mapilas mo yun eh.
Mapilas mo. Or what.
Minsan, national patrimony yung nakasalalay dun eh.
Yeah. Or may makuha kang memorabilia tapos naundoy kayo, nasira. Alam mo yun, ang daming factor eh. Ang laki ng risk. So ako gusto ko talaga digitized yung materials. But I'm not saying that there are historians who are not into collecting historical artifacts or books. Naku, marami sila. Marami yan. But what I'm saying is, what sets historians apart from collectors is that they use sources to engage in historical research, to actually write history. And using these primary sources entail that they keep their bias in check while also looking out for anachronisms.
So yeah, no, ako naman yung gusto kong point of departure sa discussion natin ngayon, sa yung mga, I think yung mga thoughts ko naman, I think kailangan rin natin talagang maging careful pagdating sa categories ng yung who can be a historian. Since sabi nga nila, anyone can lay claim to be a historian. Kailangan maingat rin tayo na maging elitist, na only historians can talk about the past, diba? Only historians can write about the past. Mahirap din yung mga ganong limiting na mga pananaw. Although historians can and should talk about history with authority and following basic disciplinal standards, mahalaga rin yung engagement with the public, I think, no? So kaya nga sa history, nagkaroon rin ng distinction na tinatawag na public history, 'di ba? Na in the simplest sense, ito yung history practiced outside quote-unquote academia, no? So ito yung pwedeng history in media, yung halimbawa museums and heritage, yung policy networks and government, and even to an extent, no, yung teaching, 'di ba, na hindi yung mga quote-unquote academic historians na naglalabas ng journal articles at ng mga libro, yung hindi lang sila yung gumagamit ng historical knowledge at historical skills. At lalong hindi lang historians yung nagko-consume at gumagamit ng historical information. So, paulit-ulit na rin natin nabanggit yung notion ng historical revisionism, tsaka yung dangers ng fake news and digital disinformation. At sinasabi nga natin na yung historical skills can immensely help in battling this. Pero yung basic skill talaga na mahalagang ma-highlight ay yung historical thinking, I think, no? So, or since everyone can be a historian, how do we think like a historian ba? 'Di ba? Parang yun din yung isang tanong na, I mean, tayo halimbawa, we spent 4 years of undergrad studying about it, 'di ba? Pero have we really spent enough time thinking about thinking like a historian, 'di ba? So, actually may isang book, no, si Sam Weinberg. Isa siyang educator. At sinulat niya yung book niya na ang title ay Historical Thinking and Other Unnatural Acts, no? So parang yung sabi niya unnatural act yung historical thinking in a sense, no, yung isang basic premise ay kasi meron talaga namang kailangan nating tanggapin na meron talagang detachment from our own reality na to the point na mahirap i-situate yung understanding natin ng past pag binagbangga natin siya sa current context natin, 'di ba? Na iba sila 'di ba? Kaya nga may common notion yung kasabihan ba tawag doon, yung history is a foreign land, 'di ba? Kaya minsan may katotohanan din yun kasi mahirap naman talagang i-locate yung sarili mo in a context na hindi ka nabubuhay doon, 'di ba? Para kang nagki-create ng mental time machine na itatransport mo yung sarili mo. So mahirap siya. Lalo pa na sa halimbawa sa yung exposure natin, yung early exposure natin sa history dito sa Pilipinas, halimbawa sa basic education natin, conflated yung yung history with civics, 'di ba? Kayo, ano yung subjects nyo na iniisip nyo na history nung dati, 'di ba? Ikaw, Lee, sa elementary school.
Kasi yung geografiya, kasaysayan at sibika, o kaya yung sibika at kultura.
Yeah, 'di ba? Ikaw, I'm sure ganun din naman sa Vec, 'di ba? 'Di ba? 'Di ba kaya nga may sibika at kultura, 'di ba? Wala naman dun sa dalawang term na yun yung kasaysayan, 'di ba? It's very specific actually na civics and culture. Yun yung pinagatas yung pagdating ng high school halimbawa or minsan kahit sa mga private school, social studies, araling panlipunan, 'di ba? So parang hindi naman siya strictly history. Kasi magkaiba yung domain nun kasi yung social studies and civics, 'di ba? Basically, ang role nun is to provide you with knowledge and information in preparation for citizenship. Ganun yung idea nung civics. Pero yung history, it's different, 'di ba? Pero dahil nako-conflate natin sa basic ed yung dalawang subject areas na yun, ang thinking minsan, no, history is yung ganon, no, na yung basically yung nauuwi siya na yung idea ng history ay consumption ng information laid down to us, no, na ito ay yung nagko-contribute din dun sa masamang image ng history equals memorization, 'di ba? Na kailangan mo lang makabisado yung facts and dates na galing sa isang authority, either a textbook or a teacher. Tapos pag kaya mo siyang i-recount, yun na yung history. Diba? Pero
ikaw na yung kasali sa Quizby.
Exactly. Ikaw na yung kasama sa Quizby. Ikaw na yung best in history sa klase kasi kaya mo siyang i-memorize. Diba? Pero as we have discussed na rin, diba? History is not about facts per se. It's more about questions. Diba nga? Yung discussion ni Vec na it's an inquiry. Diba? So, sabi nga ng isa pang author, history educator din, si Bruce Lesh, sabi niya, thinking historically means debating the past and looking at different sources to understand the past. At kaya nga, dovetail din to dun sa sinasabi ni Lee na yung isang historian ay talagang someone who is immersed in sources, 'di ba? So yun yung kailangan natin i-develop pagdating sa pag-uusap at pagpapakalat ng information about historical thinking na it is a way of questioning, examining, and drawing conclusions about the past. 'Di ba? Sabi nga rin, it's more about yung constitution ng historical thinking. May ilan siyang pwede nating masite. Halimbawa, yung historical thinking, ito galing to kay Fritz Fischer, isa ring educator ng history. Madaming literature on historical thinking and history education na pwede nating ma-share sa mga nakikinig sa kwentuhan natin. So sinasabi ni Fischer na yung historical thinking, kailangan mahalaga sa atin yung recognition that history is about questions, not answers. Yun yung number one lagi. Common yan sa literature on historical thinking. Tapos, we center our questions and inquiries on sources. Hindi lang siya, kaya din minsan, hindi rin siya, yung quality ng questions natin about the past, kailangan din nating pag-usapan. Hindi naman siya pwedeng yung counterfactuals na, paano kung hindi nangyari to? Hindi siya ganun. No? Dapat din, naka-center siya sa sources. So, and then historical thinking also involves the recognition that we use primary sources to understand the past and some secondary sources to help us contextualize yung subject na gusto nating i-discuss. Tapos, we look at and care about dates and chronology, yes, but to study change and continuity over time. Hindi natin tinitignan yung dates and chronology per se na kailangan nating ma-memorize yung dates, pero as scaffolds para maintindihan natin yung continuity and change over time. Kasi yun din yung magpapakita sa atin ng pwede nating explorations ng cause and effect, no? At history, kailangan maintindihan natin na history is not, one thing after another. No, na yung multiplicity nga ng causes na na-discuss na rin natin. Tapos sa historical thinking, mahalaga rin, yung sabi nga ni Lee din kanina, yung pagtingin natin sa authorship, kasi mahalaga yung pagtingin natin sa biases, tapos yung points of view and multiple perspective about, these narratives of the past. Tapos syempre, kaya din nating tumingin sa iba't ibang sources and examine intent and motivation. No? Tapos, yung amalgam noon, yung pagsasama-sama ng lahat nung skills na yon na nagko-constitute ng historical thinking, brings us together into, having judgments and having arguments about the past, 'di ba? So, in many ways, hindi natin kailangan maging takot sa opposing views. So, yes, may mga iba't ibang claim kasi nga there is only one past but many histories. So long as we recognize din and respect yung process ng pagtatransform ng history as the past into history as the narrative. Kasi in thinking about historical thinking, mahalaga na masama natin yung discussion, yung consumers of knowledge about the past. Kasi it should also involve them. Kasi kailangan talaga natin ma-break yung assumption na history is about memorization. Kailangan i-empower natin yung isa't isa na if you practice and reflect on historical information from a vantage point that understands how historians work, hence yung historical thinking, yung engagement natin towards distinguishing what is more credible and reliable as opposed to not, dahil sa evidence at argument, hindi lang siya base dun sa kung sino yung nagsasalita, kundi dun sa quality nung sinasabi niya. 'Di ba? Pero in terms dun sa discussion natin ng historians who work talaga on primary sources and write about the past, syempre meron tayong mga basics na hinihingi, 'di ba? As much as we would like yung engagement with the public, amongst historians, meron din tayong kahit walang regulation at walang state gatekeeping tungkol sa historians. Syempre meron tayong parang understanding kung sino ba yung good historian.
Right.
Diba?
Tama. So, binanggit nyo ngayon, I mean, yung mga napag-usapan natin in the past few minutes of this kwentuhan, ano yung how to think historically and what makes a historian, i.e., how a historian should be immersed in primary sources. And I think at this point, mahalaga ding tanungin natin, not only what makes a historian, but what makes a historian good. At sa pagsasagot ng tanong na to, I think kailangan nating ma-differentiate between a great historian and a good one. Whereas the former is more concerned about skills and the latter is about the character. So, for example, ako bilang isang relatively ay nakababatang bahagi ng ating profesyon, na who's still trying to establish herself in the discipline.
Kailangan talagang i-emphasize yung nakababata.
Well, ako ang iniisip ko naman, kasali pa rin kayo doon sa mas nakababata kahit mga 10 years yung agwat
yan yung
niyo sa akin.
gusto natin. Oh.
O kasi naman kung yung mga comparison natin, sila Teodoro Agoncillo, patay na yun, sis, diba?
True.
So gano'n. So usually I ask myself, anong klaseng historiador gusto kong maging? What kind of historian do I want to be or do I want to become? At lagi-lagi, yung mga characteristics na ina-admire ko sa isang historiador, it always boil down to 3 things. So una, humility. Pangalawa, openness or open-mindedness. At pangatlo, syempre, yung integrity. So, syempre, we wanna be great. And we really work hard into becoming great, diba? In terms of different skills like fine-combing the archives, decoding documents, becoming fluent in another language, writing elegantly. Pero while we're working to becoming great, while we're working hard on greatness, I think mahalaga din that we also work on our character bilang mga scholar. And I think these three, humility, open-mindedness, and integrity, are also prerequisite on becoming great anyway. So, kailangan mo muna itong tatlong to para maging both. Maging good historian at maging isang great historian. Kasi you can be smart. You can be really brilliant. But without a degree of openness, then there is still a high chance, a high possibility na mag-stagnate ka bilang isang scholar. Paano? How? Kasi if you are not willing to look at the works of other researchers or to spend time reading on scholarship that may come from a perspective that is different from yours or from a historical tradition that may be contrary to yours, then paano pa mapapolish, and how else can you improve on certain ideas na naisip at naisulat mo na? So I think binabanggit din ni Lee yung halaga nito kanina, ano. And openness is also necessary to achieve rigor. 'Di ba? Yung rigor in terms of historical research. Kasi, 'di ba, in the past episodes, lagi nating sinasabi na yung historical knowledge ay tentative and incomplete. So, ibig sabihin, pwede pa siyang mag-improve lagi. So, say may bagong nahalikwat or na-discover na dokumento or primary source na maaaring makapagbago sa conclusions mo, kailangan open ka pa rin doon. Yun nga, tulad ng binabanggit ni Aaron kanina, hindi mo pwedeng i-dismiss yun. Or at least, willing ka makipag-engage sa debate in terms of interpreting it. 'Di ba? Kasi hindi lang 'yun para sa growth mo bilang isang scholar, pero para din 'yun sa development ng disiplina, ng historical discipline in general. And I think this relates very closely on the second point of humility. A good historian should be humble. Dapat meron siyang kababaang loob para tanggapin na una kung ano man yung mga lumitaw sa kanyang pag-aaral, sa kanyang mga research. It may always be subject to question. And then this kind of acknowledgement should be accompanied with willingness to change her mind. So sa tingin ko, hindi naman yun kabawasan ng isang historiador, ng isang scholar, kung willing siyang baguhin yung kanyang isip in light of new evidence. And aside from this, a good historian is also someone who recognizes the limits of the values of his or of her contribution to the body of knowledge. Diba? So, kasi we know that a historical work can of course be instructive, it can be inspiring, but I don't think there has been a historical work that served as a panacea for perennial social problems. So, we are there to instruct, we are there to inspire, but we cannot say that history can solve problems. At kailangan yung i-recognize ng mga good historian bilang bahagi ng kanyang kababaang loob. Also, I think that a historian should be humble enough to willing herself to collaborate with other scholars, na hindi siya dapat magtrabahong mag-isa, to ask for other people's opinions on certain topics, and to seek for mentorship. Ito yung, I think, related din dun sa binabanggit natin kanina about auxiliary skills or auxiliary disciplines. 'Di ba? Since nga history is an interdisciplinary discipline, so I think it flourishes around or through the insights from other fields. So, kailangan humble ka enough to ask for help. So, halimbawa, dun sa mga peers natin sa archaeology or sa linguistics, a good historian should have the humility to go to them and to seek for their specialization and expertise in order to help her to make sense of these sources and to widen and to expand the variety of sources na pwede niyang gamitin sa kanyang pag-aaral. And aside from this, and I guess as in other disciplines, so a historian should recognize that she stands on the shoulders of giants. I think this is very, very important. Maaring yung isang topic na inaaral niya, may mga nag-aral na. Tulad ng kinukwento ni Lee kanina. Maaring iba lamang yung kanyang approach, iba lamang yung kanyang perspektiba, or yung balangkas or framework. Pero in that case, dapat maging humble siya enough to seek for the wisdom of these earlier works and not assume na as if siya lang yung gumawa or very novel yung kanyang naisip na research or topic. And lastly, and I think most importantly, a historian should have a high degree of integrity. Okay? In the conduct of her scholarship. And I think this goes two ways. First is integrity in terms of intellectual honesty. So, tulad nung sinabi ko sa nauna kong point kanina about recognizing the works of other scholars. So, syempre, kasama na dyan yung pag-cite sa kanila at yung pag-attribute na yung ilang mga idea at interpretation isinulat mo ay hindi originally sa'yo. Nabasa mo yan elsewhere. 'Di ba? So, in other words, wag mong angkinin yung mga nasulat at naisip na nung iba. So, lagi ko itong sinasabi sa mga estudyante ko. Tingin ko kasi kailangan itong ma-practice habang bata pa. Ano ba naman yung i-cite mo? 'Di ba? Hindi naman super hirap yung mag-cite. So, hindi naman din siya sobrang hassle. I mean, lalo na ngayon, 'di ba? Ang dali-daling mag-cite ngayon. So, saka I always tell them na ako bilang guro, halimbawa, I am more forgiving sa mga badly written essay with bad grammar or long sentences kaysa sa isang essay na plagiarize. And a serious historian, anyway, okay, should read extensively and use the things that she read and then cite them properly. Pero pangalawang aspeto ng integrity, hindi lang in terms of intellectual honesty, but also in terms of asking the question, whose interest am I serving in my work bilang isang historiador? And now, ito maaaring maging controversial to kasi some may argue that there shouldn't be any interest involved at all. And I really disagree with this. Kasi that's essentially neutrality. At sa isang mundo, at sa isang lipunan, na kahit saan ka lumingon, kahit saan ka tumingin, you can see injustice and oppression, I don't think neutrality is a moral choice. Di ba sabi nga ni Desmond Tutu, if you are neutral in situations of injustice, then you have chosen the side of the oppressor. Kasi neutrality serves nothing but a status quo. Pero may mas malala pa dito sa mga ganito na merong silent complicity. At iyon yung mga talagang explicitly taking the side of the oppressor. Ito talaga ibang klaseng pagkadismaya yung kinoko sa akin ito. Kasi, di ba, I mean, historians, self-proclaimed academics, and social scientists na ginagamit yung kanilang kaalaman sa kasaysayan at binabaluktot
Quote-unquote kaalaman.
Yeah, kaalaman at binabaluktot kung ano man tong mga kaalaman na to forward the agenda of people and institutions na nagasanhi ng paghihirap ng mga tao. 'Di ba? Doktorado ka nga, published ka nga, nagtapos ka nga sa pinakamagandang universidad sa bansa. Tapos may kita mo ang interest na sinaserve naman ay interest ng mga rehimen at institusyong pahirap sa masa. Sobrang disappointing. At ang dami kong feelings dito kasi, di ba, mahal na mahal natin yung disiplina eh. We are very passionate about it. Tapos, alam natin how our forebears in the discipline worked hard to make this world, to make this country a better place, kahit pa paano, through their scholarship. Tapos may kita mo, mga historians, kuno, and scholars na nagsisilbing mouthpiece at interpreters, di ba, ng mga oppressor. Talagang gina-justify using history, yung mga kabalbalan ng oppressors. Anyway, nakaka-agit tong episode na to. Kanina, existential crisis yung pinag-uusapan natin. Historiador ba talaga ako? Ngayon, nagagalit na tayo. Ano? But yeah, a good historian should be open-minded, should have a degree of humility, at dapat talaga sobrang taas ng regard sa integrity.
Yeah, actually, I agree dun sa sinabi mo, Vec, no, na kung ang isang historian ay ganun din naman na nagsaside with the oppressor at nag-enable ng oppression ng iba, okay na rin siguro akong hindi matawag na historian at malinya sa kanila kung ganun man, hindi.
That's
'Di ba?
very nice.
No?
Oh,
Kailangan malinaw sa atin yung pagpoposisyon ng ating sarili sa panahon ng krisis at panahon ng
So kung iyan yung historiador, hindi na lang ako historiador.
okay na rin sila, 'di ba? Okay na rin pala, 'di ba?
Pero syempre, the other side of the coin is that we can also assert
na siya yung alisin natin sa listahan.
Ito yung tamang historiography.
Totoo yan. Agree.
Kaya dapat maging comfortable din tayo to some extent na matawag na historian.
Exactly.
Yes.
Kasi may mga taong sobrang confident na tawagin yung sarili nilang historian.
Yes.
Pero forwarding, vile, and alam mo yun, politically motivated and malicious content and discourses out there, especially in the age of internet na andaling kumalat ng information.
And social media.
May affiliation lang sa academe, kala naman nila hindi na nagkakamali, diba?
Yes.
Exactly. Yun yung sigurong kailangan din nating i-put forward, no, na hindi impervious sa pag-criticize ang mga quote-unquote academic historian, kahit gaano pa yan ka-established. Basta nga, di ba yung discussion natin on historical thinking, basta babalik ka doon sa pag-question about the past at pagdi-debate about the past based on sources, you can claim, di ba, a discussion with any historian.
Kaya kailangan din talagang i-rethink, ano ba talaga yung role na dapat gampanan ng mga intellectual, ng mga historian, professional historian, and academic in terms of public debate and public discussion.
Yes, kasi in the public sphere, it's intellectuals din naman to a certain extent who shape public opinion. Meron tayong ginagampan ng papel. So in summary, who can be a historian? Sabi nga natin kanina, anyone can be a historian. But good historians know their sources. Good historians are not scared of counter-evidence. And good historians appreciate that these sources are from the past. Thus, they must exercise care in avoiding anachronisms. Sabi rin natin kanina, for one to be a historian, one must think like a historian, which entails debating the past and looking at different sources to understand the past. And finally, and I think very important, a good historian must have humility, open-mindedness, and integrity.
And that ends another episode of PODKAS. Salamat sa pagsali sa ating usapan at abangan nyo ang susunod nating episode kung saan sasagutin naman natin ang tanong na, when is an event historical?
Mukhang very interesting ang usapan sa susunod nating episode. So ituloy natin ang kwentuhan online. Pwede nyong i-like or i-follow ang aming social media pages. So check the description for more information about this. And again, thank you for listening and have a good day.